So today's reading is from the letter to the Hebrews, chapter 5. Every high priest is a man chosen to represent other people in their dealings with God. He presents their gifts to God and offers sacrifices for their sins. And he's able to deal gently with the ignorant and wayward people because he himself is subject to the same weaknesses. That is why he must offer sacrifices for his own sins as well as theirs. And no one can become a high priest simply because he wants such an honor. He himself be called by God for this work just as Aaron was. This is why Christ did not honor himself by assuming he could become high priest. No, he was chosen by God, who said to him, "You are my son. Today I have become your father." And in another passage, God said to him, "You are a priest forever in the order of Melchizedek." While Jesus was here on earth, he offered prayers and pleadings, with a loud cry and tears, to the one who could rescue him from death. And God heard his prayers because of his deep reverence for God. Even though Jesus was God's son, he learned obedience from the things he suffered. In this way, God qualified him as the perfect high priest, and he became the source of eternal salvation for all those who obey him. And God designated him to be a high priest in the order of Melchizedek.
So nice to see you all here. How are you all doing with the heat? Some people are loving it, some people not so much. I'm just going to open up my computer here 1 second.
If you're getting hot, you should move into the shade. I'm just saying because, the doctors say that.
Yeah, there's still lots of shade if you're looking for some. It's so nice to see so many people here. We're still getting used to life post-COVID, or getting close to post-COVID, and it's nice that we can all gather together again. So last week, if you were here, we were at the beach watching some baptisms, and Bob went through Hebrews 4 in the sermon. So I'm going to carry on with Hebrews 5 today, but you'll see that it kind of ties into Hebrews 4, and it does so in two significant ways that I want to talk about today. So the first is Jesus as high priest. At the end of Hebrews 4, we see Jesus described as a compassionate great high priest, and this chapter builds on that. And the second is the topic of obedience. Like Bob talked about last week, Hebrews 4 references the Israelites and how they wandered in the desert for 40 years because of their disobedience to God. We'll see in this chapter the topic of obedience coming up again, and like priesthood, it's built on. So at the beginning of chapter 5, the author starts by telling us about what makes a high priest, and he establishes 4 things in the first 4 verses that are important to take note of. So these 4 things about priesthood are, the first is that the priest is a mediator. So he's taken from among the people, and he's appointed for the people in things pertaining to God. In other words, with the high priest, he represents people in matters relating to God. The second is the humanity of the high priest. Like I said, the high priest originates from among people. That means that he can have compassion on people because the high priest is also subject to human weakness. The third is the need for sacrifice. We see in Old Testament history that the high priest offered sacrifices for sin. And the fourth is that God appoints the priest. It's not a role or an honor that any person can take on themselves. So with the qualifications of high priesthood established, the author transitions into one of the major themes of the book, which has been hinted at a couple times up until this point, and it's Jesus as high priest, the eternal high priest. Throughout the rest of the chapter, we see the 4 qualities of the high priest in Jesus. He offers access to God. He can empathize with our weaknesses because he was also a human. He died as the ultimate sacrifice for sin, and he was chosen by God for this specific task. So moving into verse 5, now that the priesthood has been established, we see that Jesus didn't glorify himself to become high priest because it's not an honor that anyone can take on himself, and that it was God who appointed him. And God says 2 things in this chapter to Jesus in regard to his priesthood. So the first is, "You are my son. today I have begotten you. So this is actually a reference to Psalm 2:7. And if you were to briefly look at Psalm 2:7 right now, you might be wondering why this psalm, because it doesn't necessarily initially look like it ties into this chapter. But Psalm 2 actually has messianic undertones. It's more subtle than some of the other prophetic or messianic psalms, but it tells us that Jesus is coming. Psalm 2 also uses the language of an everlasting promise, which is actually tied into the promise of a king. The promise of eternal kingship would have been significant for the Israelite audience that was reading this psalm. At one point in their history, which you can read about in 1 Samuel, the Israelites asked God for a king. As the story goes, God answers their request, and a man named Saul was appointed as king. I'm going to skip over a lot of detail, but the gist of it is, over time, he disobeyed God, and God actually disowned Saul. And disobedience is a pretty common story for most of Israelites' kings from that point on. What's important for our purposes today is the king that came right after Saul, and that's King David. With the establishment of David as king, God also formed a covenant with David, something that's referred to as the Davidic covenant. In 2 Samuel 7:14, God says, I will be to him a father, and he will be to me a son. The language is metaphorical, but the point is that while God would still punish future disobedient kings that came from the line of David, he would never disown them again in the way that he did King Saul. For us, the significance of this promise in this chapter is often seen in how the New Testament refers to Psalm 2 as proof of Jesus' claim to be Israel's Messiah. Verse 7, which is referenced here in Hebrews, is echoed 9 other times in the New Testament, and the rest of the psalm is seen 8 other times. What was once a metaphor for King David and his descendants, a figure of speech, became a literal historical reality in Jesus. Jesus, who let's remember is from the line of David, was God's literal son. In him we see the fulfillment of Psalm 2:7, and he is so much more and so much better than what was originally expected. His obedience to God, even unto death, is a huge part of this. The second thing that God says to Jesus in regarding to his high priesthood is that he is a priest forever according to the order of Melchizedek. This is another reference to the Psalms. Psalm 110:4 reads, The Lord has sworn and will not relent. You are a priest forever according to the order of Melchizedek. Psalm 110 was also considered a prophetic psalm announcing the Messiah's reign. Although the Israelite audience maybe didn't understand it in its entirety, this is what the Davidic kingship was building toward. Even though the earthly monarchs had failed Israel, this promise of an eternal kingship would not fail. We know that this kingship is found in Jesus. The eternal priesthood, according to the order of Melchizedek, as seen in Psalm 110:4 and Hebrews 4, points to the eternal kingship of Jesus. So why Melchizedek? Melchizedek is interesting because we don't see very much about him in the Bible. We hear of him very early on in Genesis 4, back in the days of Abraham. Actually, it was before Abraham was even called Abraham, before God had established a covenant with him, and he was just called Abram back then. And this is what Genesis tells us about Melchizedek. Melchizedek, king of Salem, brought out bread and wine. He was the priest of God Most High. And he blessed Abram and said, Blessed be Abram of God Most High, possessor of heaven and earth. And blessed be God Most High, who has delivered your enemies into your hand. And Abram gave him a tithe of all. That's it. That's the story we're given. Hebrews 7 unpacks Melchizedek more, but we're not really given any more details about him. He doesn't have a genealogy in the Bible. We don't really know who he is or what his story is beyond the fact that he was a king and a priest of the God Most High. So what's so significant about him? What does he have to do with Christ's priesthood, eternal priesthood? In biblical history, we see that the Levites were the ones that were established as priests. However, here we see that Melchizedek was also a priest, but a priest of a different sort. He was a priest before Israelites' priests were established. But it's clear from Scripture that he was a priest of the one true God. On top of that, he was a king priest. Is this starting to sound familiar from what we've been reading in the New Testament? Unlike the Levites, Levitical priests, the Bible places no limitations on Melchizedek's priesthood. This sometimes gets misinterpreted. It's not that Melchizedek himself was some sort of supernatural being or that he's Jesus himself, but more so about what he represents. His kingly priesthood, a priesthood like no other, paves the way for Jesus to establish an eternal priesthood. One that goes beyond the bounds of the earthly Levitical priesthood and fulfills the purpose of a high priest like never before. Remember that the Levitical priesthood has not yet been established at this point in the story in Genesis. But we know that the Levitical priesthood will eventually descend from Abraham. When the Levitical priesthood is established, they are responsible for collecting tithes, which sets them apart. So when Abraham tithes to Melchizedek, it's like he understands the order of things that will not happen yet in his lifetime. His tithe is an act of submission and respect to the unique service of Melchizedek to God. If Abraham, this great patriarch of our faith, tithes to Melchizedek, and then receives a blessing from Melchizedek, then that tells us something about the superiority of Melchizedek, and more importantly, the superiority of Jesus. This man, whose story is told in 3 verses in Genesis, who could have very easily been forgotten by history, exhibited this extraordinary obedience in his welcoming and blessing of Abraham. And as a result of his obedience, his understanding of God Most High, a priesthood was formed like no other. We don't hear about Melchizedek again aside from the verse in Psalm 110 until Hebrews, but when we do hear about him again, it's in the context of Jesus. According to this unique and blessed order of Melchizedek, Jesus appears as an eternal high priest. Like I said before, it's not that Melchizedek was a supernatural being, but God took his obedience and used him to establish a heavenly priesthood. The earthly Levitical priests offered sacrifices for sin, but we know that ultimately these sacrifices were not effective. But Jesus, the great high priest, according to a heavenly priesthood, is able to offer us the ultimate sacrifice for sin. So now that the priesthood and the kingship of Jesus has been established, the author shows us how else Jesus fulfills the calling of high priest. Starting in verse 7, we see that Jesus, in his human form, offered prayers and supplications to God. He was like us, vulnerable and crying out to God. This means that when we feel helpless and all we can do is cry out to God, Jesus understands because he did the same thing. Right here it says that he prayed with cries and tears. He understands the desperate prayers that we offer to God. He prayed with the same intensity. Jesus can share in the anguish that believers face. And remember the requirement that a high priest has compassion on people because he can empathize with their weakness. Here we see that Jesus far exceeds this requirement. Okay, so here's what I think is interesting. As the author is describing Jesus' humanity, he makes this incredible claim in verse 8. If you look there, it says that even though Jesus was a son of God, not just metaphorically like King David, but literally, he learned obedience from what he suffered. Sure, an ordinary son learns obedience through suffering, but Jesus wasn't an ordinary son. And yet he followed the same path of a normal son. He suffered, and in it he learned obedience. He went to the cross and he learned obedience. He experienced doing God's will at the cost of his life, and he learned obedience. He is the greatest example of learning and practicing obedience because he came to do God's will, and he perfectly completed it. Last week we saw that the Israelites didn't enter the promised land because of their disobedience. But then this week we have the sharp contrast of what perfect obedience looks like. And now the author turns it to the rest of us in verse 9, to those who obey. We are called to obey the one who showed us perfect obedience, even when he was suffering. More than just being an example for obedience, we see that Jesus was actually made perfect in his obedience. And so he is now a source of eternal salvation. He did what the earthly priests could not do, and now he is calling us to obedience as well. So what does it mean for us to be obedient? How should we understand it? I really like what C.S. Lewis has to say about this, and he frames it in the context of trusting God. So I'm just going to read his quote from Mere Christianity. He says, "To trust Christ means, of course, trying to do all that he says. There would be no sense in saying you trusted a person if you would not take his advice. Thus, if you have really handed yourself over to him, it must follow that you are trying to obey him. But trying in a new way, a less worried way, not doing these things in order to be saved, but because he has begun to save you already. Not hoping to get to heaven as a reward for your actions, but inevitably wanting to act in a certain way because a first faint gleam of heaven is already inside you. I love that. Inevitably wanting to act in a certain way because a first faint gleam of heaven is already inside you. By the grace of Jesus and the power of the Holy Spirit, you are being made perfect in your suffering and in your obedience. The first faint gleam of heaven is already inside you. Your obedience to God's will isn't what saves you. Jesus is who saves you. But your obedience is a reflection of something so much greater than your life here on earth. Jesus' perfect obedience was a reflection of his heavenly status, high priest forever. In the same way, your obedience is a reflection of your heavenly citizenship. And I just want to clarify that by perfect obedience, I do not mean that God is expecting you to follow his law without failing. Your obedience begins when you turn to God and say to him, I need you, God Most High, to do this because I can't. Your obedience begins when you realize you cannot be perfectly good, you cannot be perfectly faithful, while still being confident in yourself and relying on your own efforts. Your obedience begins when you stop putting your trust in yourself and you put your trust in God. When you trust in the process of Christ shaping you and molding you into someone that resembles himself. Just like we read earlier, Christ, the Son of God, learned perfect obedience, and he is offering to share his sonship with you. And so yes, we try and do what Christ says, but the root of that trying needs to come from this understanding of obedience, not from yourself, and from understanding Christ in you. This understanding that obedience is a mark of heaven, and that in our salvation we become citizens of heaven. Our obedience is a reflection of our understanding of our new identity as sons and daughters of God. So obedience isn't always easy. It certainly wasn't easy for Jesus when he hung on the cross dying for our sins. But God is asking for your obedience in big ways and in small ways. As I was preparing for this, I was kind of praying about what stories God might want me to share about obedience if he had any, and there was two that came to mind. So the first is a big story that a lot of you might have heard. And we've all heard stories, I think, of missionaries who heard God ask them to do something that was really hard. And so I thought of Jim Elliot, which is a story I heard growing up lots, and he was a Christian pilot who died in the middle of the Ecuadorian jungle in an attempt to share God's love. Later, the tribe that killed him came to know Jesus, and their entire community was transformed by this power of God. He suffered for his obedience, but ultimately God's will was accomplished in so many people coming to know him. There are also times when God will ask for your obedience and it will not lead to suffering, but you still have to, in a sense, put yourself out there and listen to God. I think of a story that my mother-in-law, Rena, often, well, she told me it a couple times, but I really like it, and it's stuck in my mind, and I think about it often. And she tells the story of Thanksgiving one year, and she felt like they should set 13 place settings for dinner, but they were calling out to people and asking people to come for dinner, and no one was able to come. And she starts praying, Lord, bring him in from the highways and the byways, because we have a table here and food, but there's no one to share it with. And 15 minutes before dinner, she gets a call from a traveling preacher who's there with his 5 kids, and they had picked up someone from the highway, and they came for dinner. And in the process, they really experienced God's love and care in a really special way. And I think that's just such a beautiful story of hearing God's voice and doing his will and acting in obedience, and the Lord's will being accomplished in the process. And for Jim Elliot and for Rena and for countless other believers, their obedience to God, I think, comes from a deeper understanding of what it means to hear God's voice and obey him. They probably weren't listening to God thinking that this was what was going to get them into heaven. Instead, I think their obedience is a reflection of their relationship with God and their understanding of who they are in God. Like them, our obedience needs to come from a place of gratitude and of thanksgiving for the grace of God and for our salvation. And not just a place of thanksgiving, but also a place of worship and adoration. As we obey God, as we seek to do his will, we'll grow and we'll change in the best ways. And like C.S. Lewis said, maybe in our obedience we'll see that heaven isn't as distant as we sometimes tend to think.